The morning sun had barely crested over the hills when the widow pushed open the heavy wooden door of the barn. Dust floated through the beams of light, settling over bales of hay and the old wooden stalls that once echoed with the rhythm of her husband's work. Since his passing, the ranch had grown quieter, the land heavier, and the responsibilities that fell on her shoulders seemed endless. But nothing weighed on her heart more than the care of her baby, a child who carried the last living piece of the man she had lost. That morning, she walked into the barn, expecting the usual chores. But what she found instead made her stop dead in her tracks. There, in the cool shadows of the barn, the hired girl sat on a bale of hay. In her arms, she cradled the baby as if it were her very own, rocking gently, whispering softly, and brushing strands of fine hair away from the infant's forehead. The sight struck the widow in a way she could not explain. It was as if she had walked in on a moment too intimate, too sacred to belong to anyone but a mother. Her breath caught in her chest, her fingers tightening around the rough wood of the barn door. This girl, young, quiet, and hard-working, had only been on the ranch for a few months. She had been hired out of necessity, someone to help with the endless chores the widow could no longer manage alone. Though she did her work without complaint, she rarely spoke more than a few words. Her eyes carried a weight the widow had noticed, but never dared to ask about. And yet now, in the barn, her arms held the child with a tenderness that stirred unease. The widow's mind began racing. This was her baby, her flesh and blood, the only reminder of the life she once had. No one could ever take that away. But as she stood frozen in the doorway, she could not deny the way the hired girl's face softened. The way her voice seemed to soothe the baby in a way even she sometimes could not. The child, restless through many nights, slept peacefully in her arms now, as if he belonged there. A strange shiver of fear and jealousy ran through the widow's veins. For weeks, townsfolk had whispered their judgments. A woman alone, trying to keep a ranch alive, was a story that drew pity and gossip alike. Some suggested she should sell the land. Others hinted she should find another husband to shoulder the burdens. And there were those who speculated about the hired girl herself, where she had come from, why she never spoke of family, and what secrets she might be hiding. Until this moment, the widow had dismissed such talk as idle chatter. Now, she wasn't so sure. The barn, once a place of comfort and routine, suddenly felt like the center of a storm she hadn't seen coming. The widow's hands trembled as she took a step forward, the creak of the door betraying her presence. The hired girl lifted her head quickly, her eyes meeting the widow's with a flash of something unreadable, guilt, fear, or perhaps something deeper. Neither spoke at first. The only sound was the steady rhythm of the baby's breathing, soft and innocent in a world filled with unspoken truths. In that instant, questions began to pour into the widow's mind. Why did the girl hold her baby as if he were her own? What did she whisper when she thought no one was listening? And what was the story behind those quiet, shadowed eyes? The widow had thought she had hired a helping hand, nothing more. But the way the girl clutched the child made it feel as though the line between helper and something far more personal had already blurred. The widow's grief still lingered like a shadow over every part of her life. Nights were long, and the silence of her empty bed weighed heavily. There were mornings when she thought she couldn't go on, when even feeding her baby felt like a mountain too high to climb. And in those quiet hours, the girl had been there minding the chores. Watching the child stepping into spaces the widow had not asked her to fill, but could not deny she needed. Still, nothing could have prepared her for the sight of her baby being held like this. With such unguarded love, by someone who was not his mother, the hired girl looked down again at the child, her fingers brushing across the baby's cheek as though reluctant to let go. Something in that simple gesture made the widow's heart ache. It was not only tenderness, it was longing. Deep, unspoken longing. The kind only a woman who had lost something or someone might carry. But what had she lost? What did she see in this child that seemed to claim a piece of her heart? The barn felt smaller by the second, the air thick with tension and unasked questions. The widow's voice finally broke the silence, but it came out softer than she intended, more fragile than she wanted. She asked the girl what she was doing, though the answer was plain before her eyes. The girl lifted her gaze once more, her lips parting as though words might come. But then she closed them again, choosing silence. The baby stirred, nestled deeper into her arms, and the moment stretched unbearably long. The widow's pulse quickened. This wasn't just about a baby being soothed. This was about trust, about boundaries, about the delicate thread that held her fragile world together. And now that thread felt dangerously close to snapping. She wanted to demand the truth, to snatch her child back into her arms and put distance between them. Yet she also wanted to understand, because somewhere in the quiet strength of that girl's hold, there was a story that had yet to be told. Outside, the ranch carried on as if nothing unusual had happened. The horses shifted in their stalls. The wind rattled through the trees. The day promised to be long and hard, like all the others. But inside that barn, time seemed to stop. One woman stood grieving her past, clinging to her child as her only anchor, while the other sat with a secret heavy enough to make her hands shake as she cradled the baby. Two lives, bound by circumstance, now faced each other in a silence more powerful than words. The widow stepped closer, her shadow falling over them both. The girl's grip on the baby tightened ever so slightly, a protective instinct that only deepened the mystery. For the first time, the widow wondered if hiring her had been a decision made out of desperation or fate, and as her baby sighed softly against the girl's shoulder, the widow realized something unsettling. The answers she feared most were hidden, not in the chores of the ranch or the gossip of the town, but in the quiet, secret bond forming right before her eyes. And at that moment, standing in the doorway of her barn, the widow understood one thing with absolute certainty. Nothing about this day, or the days to come, would be simple again. The widow stood rooted in the doorway of the barn, her breath shallow, as though the very air was pressing against her chest. The scene before her was simple, just a girl holding a baby, yet the weight of it felt far from simple. It was loaded with questions she could not ask, and answers she wasn't sure she wanted to hear. She had lived long enough to know that some truths, once spoken aloud, could never be taken back. Her eyes lingered on the girl, trying to piece together the fragments she knew of her. She had arrived one windy afternoon, carrying a small bag and a look that spoke of miles traveled with no place to truly call home. She hadn't said much, only that she was willing to work hard for food and a roof over her head. The widow, desperate for help and too tired to argue with fate, had agreed. Since then, the girl had moved about the ranch with quiet diligence, never asking for more than her keep. She rose early, worked late, and seemed to know her way around chores that would have worn down even the strongest men. But the barn was different. The barn was sacred. Seeing her there with the baby carved a strange ache into the widow's heart. She thought of her husband then, the way his boots used to echo across these very planks. He had loved this land, every acre of it, as though it were stitched into his very being. When he was gone, the ranch seemed to sag under the weight of his absence, and so did she. The baby had become her anchor, the only reason she woke each morning with a will to carry on. Now, as she looked at her child in another woman's arms, she felt a thread of fear wind around that anchor. Threatening to pull it loose, the baby stirred again, letting out a soft coo. And the girl's lips curved into the faintest of smiles. It wasn't a smile of amusement, it was one of recognition, the kind you see on a person who finds something lost to them. The widow noticed it, and it unsettled her. She wondered if the girl had children of her own somewhere out in the world, children she had left behind, or perhaps lost. The thought made the widow's heart soften, if only for a moment. Before the sharp edge of suspicion returned, life on the ranch had never allowed room for weakness. Each day was a struggle against the land, the weather, and the debts that seemed to multiply with every season. The widow had sold livestock to keep the roof over their heads, had traded labor for supplies, and had swallowed her pride more times than she could count. The people in town, though polite enough to her face, carried the cruel gift of gossip. They pitied her, yes, but they also doubted her. Some whispered that she wouldn't last through another winter alone. Others speculated that the hired girl was more than just help, that there was something about her presence that was bound to end in trouble. It was easy to dismiss those voices. The girl was out in the fields or mending fences, her hands raw from work, her face streaked with dust and sweat. But in the barn, with the baby nestled in her arms, those whispers grew louder in the widow's head. Was she foolish to have trusted a stranger? Was there a danger she couldn't yet see? The widow took another step forward, and the boards creaked beneath her feet. The girl's grip tightened, not in defiance but in instinct, as though letting go of the baby too quickly might cause him harm. The widow caught that small detail, and it sank deep inside her. She could not decide if it frightened her more than it comforted her. Silence stretched between them. The widow searched the girl's face for clues, for a sign of guilt, or sorrow, or truth. But the girl remained quiet, her eyes lowered again to the baby, as though the rest of the world did not matter. That silence was its own kind of answer, though not the kind the widow could accept. She wanted words, explanations, reasons that would untangle the knot in her chest. Yet she knew pushing too hard might only drive the girl deeper into herself. Later that day, as the widow went about her chores, the image would not leave her mind. Every time she bent to feed the chickens, she saw the girl's hands cradling her baby. Every time she drew water from the well, she remembered the way the child had nestled so peacefully against her shoulder. And every time the wind blew across the porch, she thought of that small smile that didn't belong to someone with no claim to her child. The widow tried to remind herself of what she knew. The girl had no family nearby. She never received letters, never spoke of her past, never gave even a hint of where she had come from. There were no visitors who claimed her, no friends who stopped by to share news. She was a mystery wrapped in plain clothing, and that mystery now reached straight into the widow's heart, where it had no place being. That night, as the baby finally drifted to sleep in his cradle, the widow sat by the fire and let her thoughts wander. The flames flickered across the room, casting shadows that seemed to echo her fears. She thought of the long nights alone before the girl had arrived, when exhaustion nearly broke her. She thought of the way the girl had stepped in wordlessly to help when her hands could do no more. Perhaps it was natural that a bond had formed between the girl and the child after. They spent much of their days together, while she struggled to keep the ranch running. But was it only that? Or was there something deeper, something hidden in the girl's silence? The widow closed her eyes and leaned back in her chair, listening to the crackle of the fire. She knew she could not ignore the unease growing inside her. A mother's heart was seldom wrong, and hers told her that the girl carried more than just a longing glance or a gentle touch. There was a story buried beneath her quiet demeanor, and that story was now entangled with her baby. Days passed, but the tension did not fade. If anything, it grew. The widow began to notice little things she had once overlooked. The way the girl lingered by the crib a moment too long. The way her voice softened only when she spoke to the child. The way she sometimes gazed out toward the horizon, as if waiting for something or someone that never came. The ranch ran smoother with the girl's help. But the widow's peace of mind grew thinner with each passing hour. One evening, while the sun dipped low behind the hills, painting the sky in streaks of gold and crimson, the widow watched from the porch as the girl carried the baby in her arms across the yard. The sight stirred something she could not name: fear, jealousy, sorrow, perhaps all three. She wanted to march down and demand answers. But the baby's laughter carried on the breeze, soft and free, and her legs would not move. She stood there instead, clutching the railing. Trapped between gratitude and dread, what unsettled her most was not what she saw, but what she felt. A creeping sense that fate had placed this girl on her ranch for a reason, and that reason was not one she could control. Something larger than herself was at work, weaving threads of past and present into a story that was only beginning to unfold. And, though she tried to push the thought aside, one truth clung stubbornly to her heart. The girl's secret, whatever it was tied to her baby. And sooner or later, the truth would come to light. The days slipped into weeks. The widow found herself watching the girl with sharper eyes. She noticed every small gesture, every glance that lingered too long on the baby. What once seemed like simple kindness now carried shadows of something deeper, something she could not quite name. The girl never spoke of her feelings, but her silence was beginning to say more than words ever could. The widow's unease became like a splinter under the skin, small, invisible to others, yet impossible to ignore. She often thought of her husband during these hours of quiet suspicion. He had been a man of few words, steady and certain, the kind who never wavered in his loyalty. She could almost hear him now, reminding her to keep her wits about her, to guard what mattered most. But she was tired, and loneliness gnawed at her resolve. The baby was her comfort, her reason for rising each day. And yet the girl, with her careful hands and soft voice, seemed to share in that bond in ways that unsettled the widow. It felt like someone slowly stepping across a line that had once been clear. The girl's past remained a locked door. But the widow began piecing together scraps from overheard words and chance observations. Once, she had caught her humming a lullaby that wasn't familiar, a tune carried with such tenderness it had to belong to a memory. Another time, the widow noticed a worn ribbon tucked into the girl's belongings, its edges frayed as though handled often. These small things hinted at a story. One, the girl was guarding with fierce determination. And though the widow wanted to believe it had nothing to do with her child, her heart told her otherwise. Tension soon seeped into the fabric of daily life on the ranch. Work still had to be done. The cattle needed tending, the fences mending. The fields cleared, but there was a quiet strain beneath every task. The widow tried to keep her distance, yet she could not help but rely on the girl's help. Without her, the ranch would falter. With her, the widow's heart was never at ease. It was a cruel twist of fate, needing someone she did not fully trust. In town, the whispers grew louder. The neighbors had sharp eyes, and they noticed the girl's presence more often now. Some wondered aloud if she was kin, though no relation had ever been named. Others suggested she might be looking for more than work, that she was planting herself into a life not meant for her. The widow heard these words in the marketplace, disguised as idle talk, but each sentence cut deep. She wondered if they saw something she was too close to admit. Meanwhile, the baby thrived under both sets of hands. He grew stronger, his laughter ringing through the farmhouse, his eyes bright with innocence. It should have brought joy, but instead it sharpened the widow's fears. For the more the child grew, the stronger the bond between him and the girl seemed to become. She caught them often now, the girl holding him when she thought no one was watching, whispering words too quiet to make out. It was as though they shared a world that excluded the widow, and that thought chilled her to the bone. One evening, as the sky turned violet with the coming night, the widow walked into the kitchen to find the girl seated by the hearth, the baby asleep against her shoulder. The firelight flickered across her face, softening the edges of her features, making her look almost like a mother lost in her own child. For a moment the widow could not move. The image before her was too raw, too personal. It felt like she had stumbled into a life that wasn't hers. A surge of anger rose, followed quickly by sorrow. She wanted to speak, to tell the girl to put him down, but the words caught in her throat. Instead, she turned quietly and left the room, her hands trembling. That night, she lay awake listening to the creaks of the house, her mind restless with questions. Who was this girl truly? Why did she seem to pour every ounce of her heart into a child that wasn't hers? And most of all, what would happen if the bond grew too strong to break? The conflict began to shape itself in her thoughts. It wasn't simply about trust anymore. It was about possession. It's about motherhood, about the thin line between help and intrusion. She feared the girl's secret, whatever it might be, but she also feared her own loneliness. The truth was harsh. She needed the girl, and the girl seemed to need the baby. That unspoken exchange held them together, even as suspicion pushed them apart. As autumn settled in, another layer of unease crept over the ranch. Supplies grew thinner, the days shorter, the nights colder. The widow worked harder than ever, her body weary, her spirit stretched thin. And through it all, the girl remained steady, her hands never faltering, her silence never breaking. Yet the more dependable she became, the heavier the widow's doubts grew. Dependence could be dangerous when hearts were involved. One afternoon, a neighbor stopped by with a load of hay. He lingered longer than usual, his eyes drifting toward the girl as she worked in the yard with the baby tied against her back in a cloth sling. The widow caught his look, and it filled her with a strange dread. Later, as he prepared to leave, he leaned closer to her and muttered, "You ought to be careful who you let near what's yours." The words struck her like a slap. Not because they were cruel, but because they echoed her own unspoken fears. That night, The widow could not shake the image of the girl standing in the yard, the child pressed against her as though they belonged to each other. She felt torn between two forces, gratitude and fear, dependence and suspicion, trust and jealousy. Every look, every gesture, every silence seemed to carry double meaning now. And she could not tell which was the truth. The girl herself gave nothing away. She worked tirelessly, cared for the baby with unfailing tenderness, and never once asked for more than her place under the widow's roof. Yet the very lack of explanation only deepened the mystery. It was as if she were waiting, biding her time, holding back a story too heavy to share. The widow began to wonder if that story, when it came, would change everything. But until it was spoken, the tension grew. Each day brought fresh doubts, fresh moments that made the widow's heart ache with fear and longing. The conflict was no longer hidden, it was woven into every hour of life on the ranch. And though the widow tried to carry on as though nothing was wrong, she knew in her heart that the storm was only beginning. The winds grew colder as winter pressed its weight upon the ranch. The days shortened, the nights stretched long, and the silence of the land seemed sharper than before. Snow dusted the hills, and the widow felt the walls of the farmhouse closing in on her. With each passing day, her unease grew heavier. The girl's presence, once a quiet comfort in the chaos of loss, had become a constant reminder of questions unanswered. The baby thrived despite the hardships. His laughter carried through the halls, a sound so sweet it cut through even the hardest of days. Yet it wasn't only the widow who drew that laughter. More and more, it was the girl's voice, the girl's touch, the girl's shadow that seemed to calm him, to coax joy out of him. And every time the widow watched, a mix of jealousy and fear burned inside her. The child was hers, her last tie to the life she had lost. Yet it sometimes felt as though she were sharing him without consent. The tension between the women was never spoken aloud, but it lived in the air, heavy as the snow clouds above. Their days unfolded with quiet precision. The girl worked tirelessly, never faltering, never complaining, but the widow's eyes tracked her every move. At night, the widow lay awake, listening for the soft sounds of footsteps in the hallway, half expecting to find the girl standing over the cradle watching the child sleep. Then small things began to happen. The widow noticed the baby's blanket folded differently than she had left it. The cradle shifted ever so slightly from its place, the scent of lavender lingering where none had been used. These were small details, almost meaningless on their own, but together they painted a picture she couldn't ignore. It was as if the girl was leaving her mark, weaving herself into the child's world in ways too subtle to call out, yet too clear to miss. One evening, as the wind howled outside and the fire struggled to keep the chill at bay, the widow walked into the kitchen to find the girl standing by the window, the baby in her arms. The child was awake, his tiny fingers tangled in the girl's hair, his wide eyes fixed on her face as if he knew only her. The widow froze, watching as the girl whispered something soft, something almost like a promise, though the words were too low to hear. For the first time, the widow felt more than suspicion, she felt fear. In town, whispers had reached a fever pitch. Someone claimed to have seen the girl meeting a stranger near the riverbank, though no proof followed the words. Another insisted the girl had once lived in a nearby settlement, that she had left suddenly, leaving behind unanswered questions. None of it could be confirmed, but all of it gnawed at the widow's peace. Each rumor added another layer to the storm building inside her. The ranch itself seemed to carry the weight of the conflict. The barn creaked louder in the wind. The fences leaned under the snow, and even the animals grew restless. The widow wondered if they too could sense the unease threading through the house. She began to feel trapped in her own home, torn between needing the girl's help and fearing what she might take in return. One night, unable to sleep, the widow rose and crept down the hallway. The house was dark, the silence broken only by the crackle of the dying fire. She moved toward the baby's room, her heart pounding with a dread she couldn't explain. When she reached the doorway, she saw the girl there, sitting by the cradle, humming the same unfamiliar lullaby she had heard before. The baby slept soundly, his small hand resting against the girl's arm. The widow's breath caught in her throat. It was a picture of motherhood, tender, unguarded, undeniable. and it wasn't hers. She stepped back before the girl could see her, retreating into the shadows, her chest tight with rage and sorrow. She felt as though the very foundation of her life was slipping away, stolen not by force, but by silence and closeness she couldn't compete with. From that night on, the widow watched more closely. She noticed how the girl's eyes often drifted to the horizon, as if waiting for someone who never came. She saw how the girl's hands trembled when she held the baby too long. Not from weakness, but from something unspoken, something she carried deep inside. It was as if the child awakened a wound the widow couldn't see. The girl sought healing in holding him. As winter deepened, the widow found herself standing at a crossroads she had not asked for. She could confront the girl, demand the truth, force the hidden story into the open. But what if the truth was worse than her fears? What if the girl claimed something she could not bear to lose? The widow hesitated, her silence becoming its own kind of prison. The tension reached its height one stormy night. The wind tore across the ranch, rattling the windows, shaking the barn doors until they banged like drums in the dark. Inside, the baby cried, restless and frightened by the storm. The widow rushed to his side, but no sooner had she lifted him than the girl appeared, her face pale, her eyes steady. Without a word, she reached for the child. Her arms open as though she had the right to take him. The widow clutched the baby tighter, her pulse hammering. Their eyes locked across the dim room. And for the first time, neither hid what they felt. The widow's fear and fury burned openly, while the girl's gaze carried something longing, sorrow, and a strength that chilled the widow to her core. The storm outside roared, but the true storm was there between them, silent and unstoppable. The baby wailed louder, his cries echoing through the house, filling every corner with urgency. The widow tried to soothe him, but he twisted in her arms, reaching out toward the girl as if drawn by some invisible thread. That simple motion cut her deeper than words ever could. The girl took a step closer, her voice trembling as she whispered the first words she had offered in weeks. "He needs me," the widow's breath caught, her grip tightening on the baby as though he might be pulled away that very moment. The fire flickered low, shadows danced across the walls, and the truth hovered just out of reach. She wanted to scream, to demand answers, to force the girl to confess what bound her so tightly to this child. But the words lodged in her throat. The moment balanced on a knife's edge, and the smallest move could shatter everything. And in that charged silence, with the storm raging outside and the baby's cries tearing at the air, the widow realized she was standing at the brink of something she could not turn back from. The conflict she had tried to contain was now a fire too fierce to ignore, and the truth, whatever it was about to demand its place in the open. The baby's cries filled the room like thunder, louder than the storm rattling the walls outside. The widow stood frozen, clutching her child close, her heart racing so fast it made her lightheaded. Across from her, the girl's face was pale, but her eyes burned with something the widow could not look away from, an urgency that felt too raw to be simple kindness. The words "he needs me" still hung in the air, trembling like a loose board about to break. For a long moment, neither moved. The widow's arms ached from holding the baby so tightly, yet she could not let go. The girl took another step forward, her voice softer now, but steadier. "Please, you deserve to know the truth." The widow's chest tightened. She had feared this moment for weeks, yet part of her wanted the truth, no matter how painful. She slowly lowered herself into the rocking chair, the baby squirming restlessly in her arms. The girl knelt in front of her, her hands folded in her lap, like someone about to confess to a priest. When she finally spoke, her words came haltingly, as though pulled from a place she had kept locked for years. She told of another life, not far from the widow's ranch, where she had once been a wife and a mother. A fever had swept through her home, leaving her alone with nothing but grief. Her child, her only child, had been taken from her, and in her sorrow she had wandered, searching for work, for purpose, for something to fill the hollow inside her. The lullaby she sang, the ribbon she kept, all of it were pieces of that lost world. The widow listened in silence, her eyes fixed on the fire's dim glow. She could see the truth in the girl's face, in the way her voice cracked when she spoke of loss. It wasn't a story spun to deceive, it was a wound that had never healed. And as the baby's cries softened in the girl's presence, The widow understood why the child had drawn her in so deeply. He was not her son, but he awakened in her a memory, a love she could not lay to rest. Tears welled in the widow's eyes, though she tried to blink them away. She had clung to her child with such ferocity, because he was her last tie to the man she had loved, to the life they had built together. The thought of sharing even a piece of him had felt unbearable. Yet now, as she looked at the girl, she saw not a thief, but a mere another woman broken by loss. Holding on to the only light she could find, the storm raged outside. But inside the house, a quieter storm began to settle. The widow's grip on the baby loosened just enough for the girl to place a hand on his back, soothing him with a touch that carried both sorrow and love. The baby stilled, his breathing evening out as sleep finally claimed him. In that moment, the widow felt something shift inside her, not the loss of what was hers, but the recognition of what they both carried, the weight of grief, the hunger for love, the desperate need for family in whatever form it could be found. The days that followed were heavy with unspoken words. But something had changed between them. The girl no longer hid her story, and the widow no longer hid her fears. They spoke in fragments at first about the girl's lost child, about the widow's late husband, about the struggles of keeping a ranch alive when the world seemed determined to see it fail. Slowly, a fragile trust grew in the spaces where suspicion once lived. The neighbors kept talking, of course. They always did. Some said the widow was a fool to keep a stranger so close. Others whispered that the girl was only waiting for her chance to claim what wasn't hers. But the widow no longer let their voices guide her heart. She had heard the truth straight from the girl's lips, and though it did not erase the tension entirely, it gave her something stronger to hold on to, understanding. The ranch survived the winter, though barely. Together, the widow and the girl worked side by side, their labor as much a bond as their words. The baby grew, his laughter warming the coldest mornings, his small steps marking the passage of time. He seemed to belong not to one woman alone, but to the home they were building together. The widow often sat by the fire at night, watching the girl with the child. Sometimes sorrow would flicker across her face, a reminder of the little one she had lost. But more often now there was peace, even gratitude. The widow had begun to realize that love was not lessened by sharing, it was multiplied. The baby had enough love for them both, and perhaps that was what he needed most. When spring came, the snow melted into rivers that ran swift across the fields. Life began to stir again, and with it came a sense of renewal. The widow stood one morning at the edge of her land, the baby on her hip, the girl beside her. She looked out at the wide sky and felt for the first time in years that the ranch did not feel empty anymore. It was not the life she had planned, nor the family she had expected, but it was a life she could live with hope. The story of the widow and the girl was not one of perfect harmony. There were still days when jealousy pricked, when sorrow arose like a tide, when silence pressed heavy. But there was also laughter, shared burdens, and a bond born from loss that had turned into something resembling strength. The widow had learned that love was not a possession to guard fiercely, but a gift to nurture, even if it meant opening her heart to someone she had once feared. And so the ranch carried on. The fences were mended, the cattle grazed, the crops were planted. Life moved forward, as it always did. The widow knew the gossip in town would never truly stop, but she no longer cared. She had her child, she had help she could trust, and she had a home that was no longer filled with silence at night. When the baby slept soundly and the fire glowed low, the widow often found herself humming the lullaby she had once feared. It no longer felt like a threat, it felt like a bridge between her child and the woman who had come into their lives. A song of sorrow, yes, but also of survival, of hearts learning to beat again after being broken in the end. What mattered was not how the story had begun with fear and suspicion, but how it had grown. Two women, bound by grief, yet holding on to hope, raising a child in the middle of a ranch that had seen too much loss. It was not the life either had imagined, but it was life all the same. And sometimes, life itself was enough. The widow's heart was no longer anchored by fear alone. It was anchored by love, messy, complicated, shared love that made each day bearable, even beautiful. As the baby stirred in his sleep, she whispered a quiet promise to him that he would always have a home, always be surrounded by love, and never know the loneliness that had once haunted both his mother and the woman who now helped raise him. The storm had passed, but its memory would remain. It had carved out the truth, forced confessions into the open, and left behind a fragile peace. And as the ranch settled into the rhythm of the seasons once more, the widow knew that their story, hers, the girls, and the babies, would live on, not as a tale of suspicion, but as a testament to the strength of love, resilience, and the unexpected ways family can be found.